I am one of the support engineers, and I was one of the support engineers, and I am the trainer and one of the solution engineers here at Keymark. And I've been around a while, and I'm quite well versed in OnBase, and I am a massive, massive nerd. And I'm going to be talking to you today about high availability and disaster recovery, specifically as it appeals to OnBase, as it applies to OnBase. So let's get going. We've got a lot to talk about today. Today we're going to be talking about terminology and planning and strategies, and some strategies for the specific, both on the platform you're using and for OnBase specifically. So with terminology, what exactly constitutes a disaster? That's anything sudden that brings down your system, basically. I mean, there's a technical definition on your screen, but it can be a lot of different things for what is a disaster. I mean, it can be anything from a tornado to a hurricane. I mean, those of us who live here in the southeast, we know from hurricane. It can be a flood. It can be a blackout. Is a disaster. I mean, if you were around in, remember the blackout in the Northeast in 2003, the cascading blackout that happened because of it actually started, I lived in Cleveland at the time, and it started in Cleveland. There was an overload in the Cleveland station that affected it turned out to be, my understanding is, one overload hit another substation that couldn't handle it, and because the infrastructure didn't have sufficient backups, it just cascaded and took down the entire eastern seaboard. So 7 hours after the blackout, from space, you can see how little light there was left on the eastern seaboard. I mean, this is a very funny slide, I think. Windows did not shut down successfully. If that happens in the middle of something important, that's a disaster. I mean, for the people who are trying to get something accomplished, that constitutes a disaster. Something as simple as corroded wires that brings down your main server, that's a disaster. A flood that takes down your server, just a local flood, not something that floods a whole area, but if the pipes in your basement leak and flood out your servers, that's a disaster too. High winds, tornadoes, those are disasters. If your one router goes down and your app server can't talk to any of your clients, you've just experienced a disaster. And of course, they're very personal disasters. High availability, in its simplest sense, is your system's ability to stay up even if something goes wrong. Generally speaking, that's accomplished by having fault tolerance and/or load balancing. And we're going to talk about both of those this morning. Disaster recovery is different from high availability. Disaster recovery is how long it takes you to get back up if you go down. So high availability is preventing you from going down when something bad happens in the first place. Disaster recovery is getting you back up after you go down when high availability isn't enough to keep you up. It doesn't matter how good your high availability system is. If you get hit by a disaster of the scope of Katrina, your system's going to go down for a few days. Even if you have battery backup that is good for 24 to 36 hours, if the entire power grid goes down for 3 weeks, you're going down. Disaster recovery is the process of getting back up to speed after that. So that's the difference between them. High availability is staying up as long as possible and preferably not going down at all. Disaster recovery is getting your data back up to speed and getting your operations back up to speed as quickly as possible after you go down at all. And there's a couple of different ways you can do both of these. High availability will use a RAID, redundant array of inexpensive disks, server clusters, and load balancing. And disaster recovery relies mostly on backup and restore, and sometimes on a cold or a warm standby site. Disaster recovery is generally easier and less expensive to implement. And it doesn't guarantee or assist with keeping a high availability structure going. Having your good backups is not the same as having high availability. The two disaster recovery is not high availability. Conversely, high availability is more expensive and harder to implement, but it can help with disaster recovery, depending on how it's implemented. So while disaster recovery is not really going to give you the high availability you want, high availability may really help you with disaster recovery. Redundancy is when you include extra components. You don't really need them in your day-to-day operation, but you have them in case your day-to-day operation fails. So if your SQL Server box goes down, you have another redundant server you can go back to. That's an example of redundancy. Monitoring is just keeping track of what's going on in your system. That's any process that keeps track of it. Whether you have emails that go out when something fails to happen, or when you reach a certain level, if your disks get to a certain level of saturation, you send a warning out. Or if you reach a certain level of traffic, you send a warning out. That's monitoring. Availability is a characteristic of a system. It's what we call the length of time a system is operational. We're going to get into some math stuff here. Don't freak out on me. Availability is generally AO, is the way it's done. And it's total time minus the downtime divided by the total time. That's how you figure out what your available time is. So you take the total time available. If you are up 24 hours in a day, you've got 24 hours in a day. We'll just talk about a single day. And you're down for 2 minutes. So your total available time then is 24 hours minus 2 minutes. So that's 24 hours. I'm actually sitting here with my calculator in front of me. 1,440 minutes minus 2, 1,438 minutes divided by 1440. So you've got 0.9986 is your AO in that. Your availability is 0.9986 in that case. You have to figure out what your tolerable downtime is. How much downtime you need. And then you can figure out what your availability needs to be. So we're talking about the nines here. And here's a good chart for it. 99% time we're talking about. 99%, you are up you're down rather, 3.65 days of the year. In a week, you're down 1 hour and 41 minutes. At 99.9% up, you're down less than 9 hours, and in a week, you're down 10 minutes. You take that down to 2 decimal places, you're down less than an hour a year, less than a minute in a week. Take it out to 3 decimal places. You're down less than 6 minutes, just over 5 minutes in an entire year 6 seconds in a week. And what does that really look like for you? Well, this is what it comes down to, is how expensive is that to maintain? And this is what you're talking about. The more nines you have, the harder and more expensive it is to implement. And that's what you have to take in mind. If you really need that kind of 5 nines uptime, you're talking some serious cash. And that may be what you require. I mean, you may be a hospital. You may have lives on the line. And you may need that kind of redundancy, but you're going to have to invest. So there's a couple of other things we need to talk about, and we're still in terminology here. Hot standby is when you have another system that is immediately available. You don't really lose any data or work. As soon as your system goes by, you've got another system that is completely redundant. You may lose like 5-10 minutes of work at the most, but you can immediately switch over into this other system and just keep working as if nothing happened. A warm standby is another system that's prepared to take over, but you may lose just a little tiny bit of work, maybe a couple of hours, at the most a day. A cold standby is another system that's ready to be started, but there's some restoration of backups required. And depending on your last backup, you could lose a day, you could lose more than a day of work. Failover is switching to a redundant or standby system. That system is automatically there, and it happens pretty much automatically. There's nothing you really need to do. This is an automatic process that your system will do for you once something abnormal occurs. So if again, we're going to talk a SQL Server here because it's a good example. If your main SQL Server fails for some reason, if your system can't talk to your main SQL Server, it automatically fails over to the other one in your cluster. Another good example, a great example actually, of failover are the OnBase inherent disk groups. If you have disk group copies, copy 2 is your failover copy. If it can't reach copy 1, that's what copy 2 is for. It then goes, oh, I can't find copy 1. I'm going to go look at copy 2. And it automatically fails over to copy 2, and you never know the difference. Recovery is when business operation has stopped for whatever reason, usually the disasters we've been talking about, maybe not completely. But recovery brings you back into being able to use your business again. You may not be up to full capacity, but you can get some work done. You can get your most critical operations working again. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about recovery. And a run book is one of the most important pieces of your entire process when we're talking recovery. It's the procedures and the operations you need to do to recover. It's what you have planned out, the steps you need to follow in the exact order you need to follow them to recover your system. And there's a recovery time objective, how long it takes you to get you to your recovery point, so that when you can get back to that level where you can actually start working again. And you have a recovery point objective. That's where you want to be. The maximum targeted period where the maximum amount of data you can lose before your business is irrevocably lost. Your recovery point objective. How much data can you lose before you're not going to be able to recover your systems at all? So we need to talk about planning a little bit. Planning is one of the most important things you can do before you have a disaster. And a lot of people just figure out, we'll figure it out as we go. But that's not going to work. Companies that have faced a disaster without a plan in place are no longer in business today. You have to plan the cost for each business system. Figure out the hard costs associated with being down for a short period of time or an extended period of time. Figure out the risks for being down. These include soft costs. Now let's talk about the difference between a hard cost and a soft cost. Hard costs. You're losing money on rent. You can't bill your customers. You can't capitalize. You can't fulfill your contracts. You can lose contracts for that. Those are hard costs. But there's soft costs involved as well. You can't get new business, so you're losing potential business. That's a soft cost. You lose your reputation. That's a soft cost. And there's other risks. The loss of reputation is a risk. The inability to keep your employees. If you're down for an extended length of time and unable to pay your employees, people are going to jump ship. That's also a soft cost, because now you've lost some of your best people and you've lost intellectual capital because of it. Determine your resumption. What order do you need to bring your systems up to minimize your downtime? You've got to bring things up in the right order. You can't bring them up indiscriminately. It doesn't do you any good to bring up your accounting system before you bring up the server that runs it. You need to establish your acceptable recovery time objective and recovery point objective. Figure out what you need to be to stay lucid, to stay viable. And then reconcile it with your available budget. Can you actually afford to be up in a day and a half? Is that feasible for you? I mean, I know it's good. I know it's what you want. But can you actually afford to do it? Can you afford that hot site that's going to be required? And then identify the risks, the types of risks you face. And by that, I'm talking about how likely is it that you're going to get hit by a hurricane? If you're in Kansas, it's not that great. If you're in South Carolina, yeah, probably. If you're in Florida, yeah, you're going to get hit by one. How likely is it you're going to get hit by an earthquake? If you're in California, plan on it. Guess what? I'm from Ohio. Been watching my friends up there. They got hit by one yesterday. Wasn't bad enough to do any damage, but they all felt it. They need to start thinking about it. On the other hand, if you are in California, you probably don't need to worry so much about tornadoes. If you're in Ohio, you need to be thinking about that a lot. Think about the types of risks you have. And don't just think about the physical dangers of risks. Hacking is a risk. Viruses are a risk. Biggest risk you face in your system right now, there are two that you are facing every single day, and you need to start planning for them right now. Risk number one, data theft. Your employees. A disgruntled employee messing up your system. It's a horrible thing to think about, but it happens. And number two, biggest risk to any system out there right now are those nasty guys who are sending out those viruses and holding your system hostage. And I can't think of the name of it. Give me a hand here, guys. You know what I'm talking about. What? No, not the scams. It's a virus. They lock out your system and you have to pay them ransomware. That's it. Thank you very much, whoever just typed that in. Ransomware. That's the biggest risk you face right now. How do you handle that? Have a plan for it. That is a huge risk for every business right now. It is rampant. So figure out the types of risk you face. Score them by their likelihood and how big an impact that will be. And then figure out how you're going to deal with it and prioritize them accordingly. And here's something that can help you. You're going to get this presentation, by the way. Look at this map. Earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanoes, tsunamis. There are very, very few places in this country where you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. I was lucky. I grew up in Northwest Pennsylvania. We didn't really have to worry about anything but the occasional tornado. And I grew up right on Lake Erie, so if it was going to be a tornado, most of the time it turned into a water spout anyway. Now I live in Western North Carolina. I kind of got to worry about everything. You got to worry about natural disasters and electrical problems. Do you have battery backup? Do you have an uninterrupted power supply? Even if you don't have an uninterrupted power supply that's enough to keep your entire business running, do you have enough of a UPS that you can gracefully shut your servers down so that you don't experience data loss by a sudden shutdown? What about network problems? Do you have a backup ISP? What about a fire issue? I got a sprinkler system. Well, that's fantastic. What's your sprinkler system going to do to the $7,000 or $8,000 worth of computer equipment sitting on your floor? Or the $50,000 worth of computer system? Do you have an appropriate fire suppression system for your infrastructure? Crime, hacking, sabotage. We just talked about that. Hardware failures. What happens if your main server's disk drive crashes? It happens. Even a solid state system can die. Process failures. Think about it. We're all changing our processes. We're becoming a much more agile system now. We're all changing the way we do work because the world is changing around us. Are we testing those systems well enough to make sure that when we implement a new process, we're not messing ourselves up? If your process fails, can you recover from that? And just plain incompetence. Think about it. How closely are you managing your users and your systems? And what does being available mean to you? Is the system available if clinicians can access medical records, but your AP team can't process invoices? Is that available? If you're a hospital, maybe. Do different departments have different requirements? Which software is critical to each area? And do all of your departments need to be up for your system to be considered available to you? If tech support is down, but sales is not, is your system available? And how do you measure it? Maintenance windows count. If you go down for a planned maintenance window, is that considered downtime? In some cases it is. Some organizations don't consider that downtime because it's planned. Some organizations only consider unplanned downtime as downtime. And do you track peak usage or just low usage? Then you need to document all of this. This is your run book I was talking about. All of your recovery steps need to be very carefully documented. And then you need to run disaster drills, because just having a book is no good. Because think about it. The worst has happened. You have been hit by, pick a disaster. Tornado, hurricane, blackout, whatever. Lightning has struck, your building has been burned to the ground. Pick a disaster. You find your book. Do you really want to have to take the 5 hours to read through it and figure out who you need to call, who needs to be involved, what's going on, before you can start actually getting started? No. Run the disaster drills with the team that's involved. Do it regularly, at least once a year, preferably every 6 months, if not every quarter. Prove your backup reliability. Now, this is something that when I'm talking about backups with OnBase, anybody who's heard me talk about database backups will hear me say this. Every time you back something up, restore it somewhere to make sure it works. That should just be part of your regular backup maintenance. Restore it and check it for integrity every single time. Because an unproven backup isn't a backup. It's just a paperweight. And again, check them for corruption. Because just because you have the backup and you can restore it doesn't mean something didn't get backed up wrong. Because nothing's perfect. And established off-site backups. Now, there used to be a rule prior to Katrina to keep an off-site backup 2 hours drive time away. And then Katrina hit. And people in the Crescent City found out that 2 hours drive time away is not enough, because those backups got wiped out too. And it turned out that even 4 hours drive time wasn't enough. And Matthew proved that as well, just a couple years back. So the new rule is 2 to 4 hours flight time away. This is why the cloud is a fantastic way to do some backups. This is one of the strengths of the OnBase cloud backup and having OnBase do some hosting for you, is because their backups, they mirror all of their sites. Don't know if you know this, those of you who are using OnBase's global cloud services. Their mirrored sites are, well, I think the mirrored site for their Andover, Maryland is in Kansas, I believe. The mirror site for England, I want to say, is in Amsterdam. They do a really good job of separating their sites. And it's very important that you do the same. I mean, it doesn't have to be that drastic. But establish off-site backups. And if you're going to be doing your backup in the cloud, do the research. Talk to the company where you're putting it. Find out where their backups are. They'll tell you if you ask. Be sure to ask. What's their backup procedure? Don't just trust that they're doing it right. Ask them. Backups don't exist if they haven't been verified. And you don't have a disaster recovery plan until you've tested it. Those are two things to remember. Now, let's talk some strategy here. Platform strategy. Hardware components of your high availability disaster strategy cost money, sometimes a lot. So you have to plan your strategies to make sure you're getting what you need and not killing your budget. So there's a couple ways you can do it. For your platform, you can cluster. Multiple servers host a lot of different services. It's more expensive for the operating system. It requires more knowledgeable resources, but you can get to 4 or 5 of those 9s this way. With network, redundancy goes a long way because links are going to go out. This is especially important if your data center and your users aren't geographically together. If you've got scattered users, you really need to watch your network redundancy. Have a second ISP. Load balancing is a very effective and reasonably priced way to get high availability. OnBase is load balancer agnostic. We don't care. All load balancers are supported. But load balancer and OnBase session expiration need to be synchronized, and you need to keep that in mind. Now, there's 2 basic architectures for load balancing. There's stovepipe and bowtie. Stovepipe, you basically do the load balancing on the front end to in the OnBase world, to the web server, and then each web server connects to a specific app server. There's a hybrid version as well, where there's one web server that's load balanced to multiple app servers. And then there's the bow tie, where there's multiple load balancers, where you have a load balance to multiple app servers, and then those web servers, and then those web servers are load balanced to multiple app servers. OnBase works great with any of that. Virtualization is also a great way to have high availability. VMware, Citrix, fully supported by OnBase. Very quick to restore. And with products like vMotion, you can move from one piece of hardware to another with very little downtime. It provides very effective both high availability and disaster recovery, because if you've got a golden image sitting there, boom, just put it up on a new piece of hardware, you're done. But you need to do it carefully. Consider the impact of sharing your physical resources on the host. I cannot tell you the number of times we've gotten calls in support saying all of a sudden our OnBase system is slow, and it turns out they've overextended a virtual host. So design your host to handle the maximum load of all of those VMs. And consider dedicating hosts to specific high-traffic, high-volume VMs. Don't overextend your hosts, because you will affect everybody, and you will affect them negatively. And if you're doing virtualization, there's a priority to it. You can absolutely virtualize your DDS or file server, and your processing stations, and your web server. Then get to your application server and your database server. Now, I am not going to read this out loud, but I will say OnBase does not recommend virtualizing all of these. We've seen it done. We've seen it done many, many times, very successfully. However, I am just throwing it out there. OnBase does not recommend it, and recommends that the app server and the database server be on physical servers, not virtual servers. If you're virtualizing them, there's nothing wrong with it. Like I said, we've got lots of customers doing it very successfully, but it is not Hyland's recommendation. It's supported, but it is not their recommendation. Storage. There's 3 ways you can do storage. There's online. That's absolute active right now. There's nearline, backups, very easy to get to, quickly restored to online status. And then there's offline. That's the remote stuff. That's the stuff that's stored 4 hours away. Take longer to restore. So those are your 3 kinds of proximities for storage. Disaster recovery is often done on tape, nearline and offline usually. if remotely restored, that's your best bet to get back from a major structural problem. Optical storage is usually done nearline. Disk is usually online. Nearline if it's redundant NAS or SAN. RAID disks are online. If you've got partial damage, depending on the RAID selection, if you're using parity, it can be used if one disk goes bad in the RAID, you can still get your recovery back. Cloud, depending on your provider, can be nearline, online, or offline. High availability, optical, nearline. Disk, online. RAID, online. Cloud, again. For high availability, that can be on or nearline, again, depending on your contract and the provider. For storage, SAN will generally have your highest performance with high availability benefits. A read once, write once, read many, a worm disk. Great for backup, a little slow to write out. Replication and storage virtualization can be a good way to go. For disk groups in OnBase, media really doesn't matter except for performance and the fact that your first copy must be mass storage, whether that's SAN or a hard disk, either one works. Disk groups provide a hot failover. Disk groups copy, built-in failover, I mentioned this earlier. Storage, replication, and storage virtualization. Backups through disk groups are a cold backup. They can be restored, but it is a cold failover. Have more than one copy, and if you're going to have more than one copy of your disk groups, don't put them on the same physical box. If it goes down, you've lost everything. And use RAID for the first and the most inexpensive level of high availability. OnBase recommends RAID 1 or RAID 10 and supports many other options, including striking with parity, RAID 50. You can validate your platters, make backups, and monitor and maintain off-site copies. For OnBase, for a hot database, we do support failover clustering. This is cool. If your database goes down, cluster over to the new one. OnBase supports database mirroring. This is only for failover. With high safety, with a witness, high safety without a witness, manual failover, and high performance manual failover. All of those are supported. Mirroring in high safety mode, not committed until they're hardened. Mirror in high performance mode, they're hardened, and it's not considered complete until it's hardened on both sides. Log shipping. SQL Server does provide the ability to use log shipping. It can be used with OnBase. It's a warm database backup. It's mirroring without a witness, and virtualization is also possible. And of course, there's a cold database backup, which is just a backup and it gets restored. But check your corruption with every backup. And if corruption is ever found, either in the backup or in your database itself, contact Keymark support immediately before you take any action of any kind. Note about corruption. OnBase database transactions are not multi-statement. Therefore, when something goes wrong, investigation will be required, and very specific OnBase knowledge is necessary. Do not try to figure this out by yourself, DBAs, because you are going to get it wrong, and you will have the possibility of A, messing up your database even worse, and B, invalidating your contract with Highland and Keymark. The net result of that is, if anything goes wrong, Highland's going to charge you to fix it. For your application servers, use load balancing. OnBase does not, under any circumstances, support clustering. They can be virtualized. Again, it's not recommended to virtualize the app server, but go ahead and virtualize the web server. Your disk group servers, your DDS servers, can be load balanced. Does not support clustering, but they can be virtualized. Processing and timer servers can be load balancing, but you need sufficient licenses to put them on different machines. Clustering can be really hard to implement, so be careful with that. They can absolutely be virtualized. And you can keep a second copy of the software offline and configured. That is not a licensed violation. You don't need a second license for that. To have a second copy offline, a cold copy, is fine. It doesn't require a second license. And then when the first one comes down, you bring that up. That's fine and does not require a second license as long as they are not both online at the same time. Workstation and timer registration makes it a manual failover process, although associated licenses, which were new in 17, make that a lot easier. Now, here's the thing. High availability and disaster recovery are different, but they are or can be very complementary to one another. You need to prioritize what you need so that you can make trade-offs and figure out what you can live without. They're both very expensive things to do, and you've got a limited budget. Figure out what you need and what you can afford. Identify your risks. And don't forget insurance. And by insurance, I'm not just talking about buying a policy. I'm talking about figuring out what you need to do inside your company to ensure that you're going to be all right. Your backups, your failovers, that kind of insurance. Figure out your constraints, time, budget, and people. You know, you may want to be up and running again after a complete failure in a day and a half. But do you have the staffing to do that? Plan, document, and test your recovery plan. And then test it again. Questions? Do we have questions? Questions going once. Questions going twice. Well, I hope that was useful to you. I really do. I'm kind of passionate about this stuff. One of my degrees is in security, and high availability and disaster recovery are a huge part of being a secure company. I hope you join us next month on July the 10th for our next webinar, Upgrading OnBase with a Pre-Production System, something else I'm very excited about. It's something that we recommend you do if you can. Something we covered at Insights this year. I hope you joined us there. And we will see you in July. Do we have a question? We do have a question. Do we have a sample disaster recovery architecture for SQL database? A disaster recovery for SQL database? No, unfortunately we don't. What we would recommend is following SQL's best practices for failover. As I said, you'll be getting a copy of this in the next day or so, and I do go over what's covered there. Mirroring is a good way to go. Failover clustering is a good way to go. The disaster recovery guides, if you download from our FTP site, or if you go out to community and download the database guides that are out there, there are quite a few database guides that OnBase has, and I can give you the names of them. The database reference guide in particular is very good and gives some good recommendations on what is supported and what to do for that. That's a very good resource to use for figuring that out and for what is actually supported with OnBase. There are things that are supported and are not supported, and I did go over some of them, and they are in the PowerPoint that you will be getting, and they are also listed in the database reference guide. What are the most common missteps in OnBase disaster recovery? The most common misstep in OnBase disaster recovery is not having a plan. And the other most common misstep is having your disk groups, having a copy 2 and putting it, believe it or not, on the same box as copy 1. We see that actually way too often. And not checking your database backups. Those are the 3 most common problems we see. But the biggest problem, and it's not just with OnBase, but it's with any disaster plan, is not having a plan at all, just never thinking about it. Never thinking, well, what happens if my application server goes down? If this one application server that is running all of my workflow and all of my web servers and all of my Unity clients goes down for 6 hours because the power on it blew or my CPU dies, and now all of my users can't work for a day. What do I do? And not having any kind of an idea of how to address that. Just not having any sort of plan or backup in place at all. Any other questions? We've got a couple more minutes here, guys. And girls, ladies. No, looks like we've got another question coming in. Invite for the next webinar. The next webinar is available at keymarkinc.com under events. There is a webinar. It is up there, and you can register on the website. And an email will come out probably next week. You can always find all of our events, our webinars, and any conferences we have going up at keymarkinc.com under events. And there's also blogs out there as well. We try to keep blogs coming regularly. I've been kind of busy with training this year, so I haven't contributed as often as I want to, but I'm hoping to get some time to get some up there myself pretty soon. Any other questions? All right, you will be getting, when you leave the webinar, you will be getting a survey. I'm going to ask you very kindly to fill that out. And please, in the comments, if there are any topics you would like to see in future webinars, please fill that in and let me know. I'm the one who designs this content, and I listen. I was doing an OnBase tips and tricks, which was gauged to administrators. And one of the comments we got back after that one was that they thought it was going to be for end users. And the result of that was we created one for end users because I thought it was a good idea. So we do listen to you. Let me know what you want to see, and if it's possible, I'm going to do it for you. So please fill out your surveys and let us know what you think. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate very much you guys taking an hour out of your day to spend with me this morning. And we hopefully will see you all next month. Thanks a lot.